Messages from Her Excellency the Governor General.
I'm in receipt of a message from Her Excellency the Governor General dated August 2018. It reads as follows. Her Excellency the Governor General has the honor to inform the Honourable the Senate that she will be absent from the country during the period August 28, 2018 to September 16, 2018 on vacation leave. Her Excellency further has the honor to inform the Honourable the Senate that in accordance with the provisions of Section 29(1)(a) of the Constitution, Mr. Kenneth Rudolph Hewitt, CBE, BJH, will perform the functions of the Office of Governor General for the period of Her Excellency's absence.
Announcements by Your Honor the President. Announcements by Your Honor.
Yes, thank you. I've received a message from, a note from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, accompanied by a courtesy translation of a letter that was received from Speaker of the National Assembly of Kuwait, addressed to His Excellency Mr. Sir Richard Cheltenham, President of the Senate. And it reads as follows. Your Excellency, it is with pleasure to forward my sincere congratulations to Your Excellency on the occasion of your election for the presidency of the Senate in Barbados. This election is an assurance of trust in your ability to fulfill the responsibilities of the esteemed post. I wish Your Excellency continuous success, believing in your capability in enhancing the mutual activity between our parliaments, which is an objective we all strive to achieve. Please accept the highest of my considerations. Sincerely yours, Masood Ali Al-Ghanim, Speaker of the National Assembly of Kuwait. I will send him in return an appropriate response. Continuing on, I'm advised that I'm in receipt of a letter from Senator the Honourable K.S. McConney, which reads as follows. Dear Mr. President, I write to inform you that I will be out of the island from August 26th to September 1st, and respectfully ask to be excused from the sixth sitting of the Honourable the Senate on Wednesday, August 29, 2018. Yours sincerely, Senator the Honourable K.S. McConney. I'm also in receipt of communication from Senator Christopher A. Maynard. It's dated the 26th of August, 2018, and it is addressed to His Honor the President, and reads as follows. Dear Sir, I regret that I will be unable to attend the sixth sitting of the Honourable Senate on Wednesday, 29th of August, 2018. I shall be traveling to Canada on Wednesday, the 29th of August, 2018 to attend to an urgent family matter which cannot be postponed. I will return in Barbados on September 2nd, 2018. I beg your indulgence in this matter. Sincerely, Senator Dr. Christopher A. Maynard. Is there any other communication that I need to draw to your attention? Submit on that. Yes. Yes.
From the 17th of August until the 12th of September.
No, I just read that.
No, this one. No. 17 of August.
Yes, my attention too is just been drawn to communication from Senator Tony Moore that she will be a bit late, and I have an excuse too from Senator Reverend Maxwell that he will be off the island from the 17th of August to the 3rd of September, 2018. So I think that completes the everybody received it either, or did he?
Yeah, everybody.
Yeah.
That's for confirmation.
I'm in receipt too of minutes of the proceedings of the Honourable the Senate for the 15th day of August 2018. At the appropriate time, we seek to confirm these minutes. Copies relate to the same date, 15th of August 2018. That brings us to the end of communications, which I needed to draw to your attention.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers.
Mr. President, I'm commanded to lay the Barbados Estimates, document 2018 to 2019.
Reports from select committees, questions to ministers, request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance, statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries, personal explanations, motions relating to the business or sittings of the Senate moved by a minister, introduction of bills.
Mr. President, I beg to give notice of the Road Traffic Amendment Bill 2018. Mr. President, I beg to move the first reading of the Road Traffic Amendment Bill 2018.
Traffic Amendment Bill 2018 has been read the first time. All those in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Public business. Order number 1, in the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Fiscal Incentives Repeal Bill 2018.
Mr. President, as I rise to the second reading of this bill, the Fiscal Incentives Repeal Bill 2018, I thought, certainly for myself and for the benefit of some others in the chamber, that perhaps there should be some background to this piece of legislation. I think it goes back to the 1960s and early 70s, when certainly in developing countries, and pushed to a large extent by the Nobel laureate, Sir Arthur Lewis, the concept of dual economies, when he spoke about small developing countries, which prior to that focus on monoculture, the export of sugar or bananas, that there was a need to look at a dual economy where these small countries in terms could look to manufacturing to some extent to provide products that would be utilized in these countries, could be exported, and in so doing bring foreign exchange to these countries. In addition, of course, it would provide drugs. jobs for persons in those countries. I think a number of us would be familiar with the Operation Bootstrap in Puerto Rico, which I know a number of honorable senators would have dealt with when they did geography in secondary schools not so long ago. And so it came out of this matter in this approach to the management of our economies and stimulating growth in economies in the Caribbean that Barbados followed suit in terms of this fiscal incentive legislation. And I stand to be corrected, but I believe it was indeed the father of an honorable member of this chamber who was instrumental in 1974 in piloting this Fiscal Incentives Act into the laws of Barbados back then. And so it was very simple. It was to stimulate manufacturing, create jobs, and indeed to bring foreign exchange into the country, a very commendable role in terms of this legislation. I'm not going to get into the intricacies of the legislation, but suffice it to say that there were various criteria on which manufacturing entities could apply for some exemptions and to cut in terms of a tax holiday. That was the term that was used, and it varied in terms of the duration. Initially it was 15 years in which there were no payment of corporation taxes, and these entities would be, in terms of duties and customs, taxes and customs duties, would be waived over the period of the tax holiday. Over time, the tax holiday was adjusted for some companies based on what they were producing and stuff like this. But essentially, there were some criteria which had to be fulfilled, and I believe one was in terms of the capital investment by a manufacturing entity. If it was over 50 million, they could apply for the exemption. Another category spoke of persons, entities, which were producing goods for export, only for exportation. And these were classified as enclave enterprises. And then there were various categories of those companies depending on the percentage of what they call local value added to the products, which were being manufactured. And these could be used locally, exported regionally, or internationally. And that was the basis on which one could apply. And indeed, as I said earlier, you had the tax waiving, but also it applied to dividends for investors in those manufacturing entities. In terms of taxes on the dividends earned, they were exempt. In addition, there was the ability to carry forward losses for 9 years after the period of the tax holiday had ended for these companies. So in all, it made it very attractive in terms of encouraging these companies to come to Barbados. In the heyday, there were several companies, I believe, in terms of income earned, running to hundreds of millions of dollars in Barbados. And certainly over the years, thousands of Barbadians were gainfully employed in these various manufacturing entities. And especially between the period 1976 to 86, I'm reminded that it really started to kick off in those days, 1976 to 86, having had the foundation being laid by one government, the other then utilized it efficiently and effectively to push manufacturing ahead in Barbados, to the benefit of all citizens, of course. But as time went on, things changed, and governments moved into applying some of these exemptions to various entities. Certainly in 1994, there was a memo to the Comptroller of Customs in Barbados after a budget speech in which this exemption of customs duties was, provided you could meet certain criteria, was extended. These benefits were then conferred on, and concessions were conferred on not only manufacturers, but it was extended to agriculturalists and even those, the Senator, just get the Senator Frank, they would be familiar in terms of those who were also involved in fisheries. So it was extended from manufacturing to agriculture to fisheries. So it became less attractive in terms of the waiving of custom duties and taxes. And so the real benefit now was just corporation taxes. In terms of the accessibility to this enterprise, to these incentives, it sort of was disadvantageous to small entities in that the process was tedious in terms of applying, and it was very difficult for small entities to in fact benefit it. There were, I'll probably list a few of the things that were required, Mr. President. As I said, it was a high level of detail and volume of information that had to be submitted on the application. And then it was an issue in the length of time it took to process these applications, and which was at least a month upon receipt of the application. It was necessary, first of all, the process, you had to conduct a site visit to confirm the details in the application. There was need to convene a meeting of risk analysis, monitoring, and control of industrial development committee to carry out an environmental impact assessment. There was need to conduct an analysis of the details in the questionnaire, the financial statements, and as I said, the environmental assessment. And this multifaceted analysis included a review of past and present experiences of similar types of projects in Barbados, a technical assessment of the project covering the production process, quality control, technology, and design characteristics of the projects. After all of this was done, you needed whether the project would be adequately financed, and an analysis of the extent and experience of the management capacity of the individuals managing the company. And of course, an economic analysis of the compensation to the country for any loss of fiscal revenue. And some would then say that in all of this, obviously small manufacturing entities would be at a distinct disadvantage. After that was completed, you then had to make the recommendation was then made to the board of the BIDC, which would then discuss that and advise the minister responsible for industry, commerce, etc., and inform the decision then rests solely with the minister. He can make the final determination in terms of the award of concessions or not. And this later led to some problems, which I will come to later on in my presentation. So therefore, we have this situation where you have this process where you can apply for exemptions under this legislation. But then we go to the forays of the creation of the World Trade Organization in the 1990s, an agency responsible for developing rules of trade and for ensuring the fairness and equity in global trading. Barbados became a signatory to the WTO on the 1st of January 1995. And with that, Barbados was expected to comply with some of the obligations and commitments. Having signed it, it had given certain commitments and obligations to the WTO in terms of its articles and agreements. But in this circumstance, especially as it related to subsidies and countervailing measures. And under Article 3 of the WTO's subsidies and countervailing measures, we were in direct contravention. In that, when these concessions that we were given were in direct contravention to that. At a meeting in 1995, as I said, we signed, we were given 8 years to phase out these subsidies. And this was not only Barbados, but generally small developing countries who had previously given these sort of concessions, which I spoke to. As I said, it was a movement not only in the Caribbean back in the 60s, but certainly in Africa and in parts of the Pacific. So we were then told that we were in contravention. But at a subsequent meeting, because of the pleadings of the developing countries, the grace period was extended to 2000, and grace period extension, it was granted in 2007. Obviously, several countries had not compiled by 2003. And under Article 27.4 of the same subsidies and countervailing measures, and the new date was granted of December the 31st, 2015, with the proviso that the WTO would accept no further extensions after that date. Mr. President, obviously, that date has passed. We are now approaching 3 years since that date, the final date of December the 31st. Hence, the reason why we are here, that we are in contravention of this. And Mr. President, you would be aware that in terms of international trade, that we are from time to time blacklisted. I believe now we are gray listed. I'm not saying that this contravention is the main reason why we are in this position vis-a-vis the EU and the OECD. But obviously, in terms of the EU, it plays a role. The EU is concerned under their code of conduct in terms and the need to have tax good governance standards that in not only in terms of the tax exemptions, but that the minister had sole discretion. And as far as that they're concerned in terms of their tax good governance standards, that lacks transparency. That at the end of the process, the minister can determine who he's going to give it to, if he's going to give it to Senator Tate, or if he's going to give it to Senator Franklin. If he thinks that Senator Franklin is obtuse, he might decide he wants to give it to Senator Adams. And this is in direct contravention to the EU codes of good conduct. So hence we have to fall in line. I think countries in the Caribbean have moved forward in terms of this process. Just scurrying through the file just now, I realized that the draft cabinet paper for this matter was prepared in 2016, and then another draft of it was done in 2017, and then finally in April this year. We've seen it as being something that needs to be addressed urgently, and hence we have brought it to this Honourable Chamber seeking that it be repealed. But I can't speak about the incentives bill without reflecting and commending the Barbados Industrial Development Corporation for the extremely good work which it has done in this country over, I believe, over 5 decades in terms of promoting manufacturing, in terms of the good work it has done to encourage manufacturers to the sector, in terms of the work it has done in export assistance. And indeed, I have no doubt that another honourable senator will speak in terms of the good work it has done for the small business and manufacturing sector in this country. And I believe that they've played a vital role in terms of our economy, in terms of stimulating employment, in terms of bringing investment to this country. And I believe that the good work of that entity should be commended as we move forward. Mr. President, as I said at the outset, it's a fairly straightforward, though some might consider a bit technical matter. And with these few words, where I try to give a background, I beg to move that this bill be now read a second time.
It's been moved that the bill under consideration be now read a second time. All those in favor?
Mr. President, I want to to thank the Senator Walcott for that background that we just had. And there are a few things that he mentioned that I would like to query and bring attention to the chamber. In his summary and synopsis, he noted that the WTO is an organization that is on the premise of fair and equitable trade. I think if one looks at the history of the WTO, how it was conceptualized and then implemented, fair and equitable are things that were very far from the table in the beginning stages of the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization was essentially put in place to regulate free trade and the implementation of globalized trade. That type of framework we saw was at the disadvantage of small economies. We saw what happened to the OECS as it relates to their banana industry. We saw what happened to our sugar industry as it relates to the trade issues that we had going forward after the WTO was implemented. The WTO, when you look at it, is actually a framework that favors multinational organizations, MNCs, multinational corporations. So when you have small industries like Barbados and small producers, they are at a complete disadvantage when you look at the global markets and the things that are allowed under the WTO regulations. So I understand that we've already signed on and we have to be compliant and we have to be aligned with international trade agreements and protocols. That is obviously clear. But what I want to know is if Barbados and the rest of the region, and I'm sure this is a conversation that other small island developing states have as well, is how are we as disadvantaged economies showing to these international organizations that the implementation process of a lot of these international agreements are not conducive for our economies? That is something that we as a country and as a region, we have to start taking stock of. Because when we sign on blindly, and then we see a collapse of an industry 10, 15 years later, when it no longer serves the WTO and the multinational corporations anymore, because if you look at the history of it as well, and I didn't want to go that far back, but I will. A lot of these countries in WTO that are also multinational corporations owned are former colonial countries. So when it was no longer opportune for them to be extractive, the same trade agreements we were working off of, but it no longer served them, a new framework was in place. When we were independent, then we were left to pick up the pieces of how do we manage not having those special terms and agreements. And that was the issue going forward, particularly when you looked at the banana industry and when you looked at the sugar industry. The other question I'd like to ask the government in particular is, do we know how many firms are actually benefiting at this moment as it relates to these incentives? We do. The question then becomes, what is the valuation of the firms? How many persons are they employing? What export contribution are they making to the country? Because those are significant things that we need to know if we're repealing something that these firms are benefiting from. What I would also like to bring to the attention of the chamber is, if we are saying we're repealing the act, what are we replacing it with? A lot of the times, acts are in place, and if you say to me, well, on the international stage, we are not compliant. It is illegal, so to speak, to have these types of incentives on the book. Was the act actually being utilized? And was it being utilized to a point where there will be significant ramifications after we repeal it? So I think has there also been consultation with the Barbados Manufacturing Association? That is another question that needs to be asked with this repeal. Did they have any contentions with the repeal? So what I ask now is, repeal and are we replacing it, and with what? What is the framework going forward for the manufacturing sector in Barbados? In the 1970s, manufacturing contributed about 20% to GDP in Barbados. That was mainly from beverages, tobacco production, chemicals, and petroleum products. The highest amount of persons employed in the sector was in 1997. Approximately around 12,000 people were employed in the manufacturing sector. The last central bank report noted that, on average, manufacturing was contributing 2% to GDP. And in the last 4 to 5 years, there has been a stagnation of persons in the sector from around 7,000 persons to 8,000 persons. What I see in those numbers is clearly an opportunity to increase the productive capacity of the manufacturing sector in Barbados. We have a youth unemployment rate of around 28%, I believe it is, which is extremely high. So you have the opportunity to build capacity and to absorb some of the youth unemployment that we have in Barbados with the right training and the right economic opportunities. Mr. President, I'd also like to bring to the attention of the Chamber a study that I did in 2012 with the economists at the Central Bank. It's a working central bank paper. There's also always this notion of manufacturing cannot work in small island states. And that is not true. It is simply not true. The study found that firm growth was directly correlated or positively correlated with firms who had high labor productivity, plant size, which was compatible with the products that they were using. They also invested heavily in research and development. And another glaring result of the study was that firms that did better had a higher proportion of skilled labor in their manufacturing firm versus unskilled labor. So if we have determinants that are clearly successful determinants to manufacturing in Barbados, the framework by which we then build an industry around should be based on research such as this. You give exemptions to persons who have higher proportions of skilled labor to unskilled labor in their plant. You give exemptions to those persons who are spending on research and development in their manufacturing plant. So again, I ask, repeal this and replace it with what? So clearly then the goal going forward has to be encouraging small and medium-sized plants that have skill-intensive labor along with export orientation. How do we do that? There needs to be a participatory approach to this. Government cannot simply put together the framework. The persons in the sector have a very clear understanding of what it is that they need. So then I also am a little worried that we're repealing this without proper consultation. I understand that we have a timeline that we have to meet, but we still have to be very sensitive to those persons working in the industry and who are actually utilizing this bill. Mr. President, there are also some very promising things that we have here in Barbados that can be linked to light manufacturing. We have two particular products that I came across recently that I was appalled that we don't take advantage of in developing industries from them. One is aloe barbadensis, which is a particular type of aloe vera, and it's extremely valuable because it's found in a host of beauty products, soaps, creams, and the like. And it's just growing wild in Barbados without any type of research and development into how we can make it into a productive sector, or industry rather. The other one is the one that we've heard so much about, West Indian Sea Island cotton. Sea Island cotton fetches for US $10 per pound, the last market value that I saw on the international world market, versus Egyptian cotton that goes for US $1 per pound. That is a complete travesty that we in the region have not taken Sea Island cotton to the point where we are competing against Egyptian cotton.
Lost the culture.
Yeah. I spoke to someone and he said it very, very succinctly. If grapes were indigenous to the Caribbean, the world will never know what wine was. Succinctly. Because we don't take advantage of what is in our backyard and we don't know how to add value to it, to present it to the rest of the world. Champagne. There's nothing spectacular about champagne. But in order for it to be called champagne, it must be from Champagne in France. So why can't we make or use a variety of the aloe vera that we have, patent it, create some crossbreed or something of the like, and say, you know, it is from Barbados. You use the islandness that you have to create a niche product. Your islandness. So these are the things that we have to start discussing when we talk about industry and manufacturing, or like manufacturing. Integrating the agricultural products that we have in order to be competitive and to grow our manufacturing base. Because I said it in my last presentation, we're being pigeonholed now into a monosectoral economy where everything now we are going to rely on services. And we simply cannot do that. If I am an investor in manufacturing and I wanted to get into Sea Island cotton here in Barbados, because we're repealing this, the question I am going to ask as an investor is, so what is the framework that guides my operations? What is the framework that guides my operations? If I come to Barbados with $100 million tomorrow, or let's say 2 weeks from now when it actually is repealed, what is the framework that is guiding my operations? So these are the type of questions that I have when we say we're repealing this bill. The other side of the coin, because I spoke about the value added that we can have with the particular products that are indigenous to Barbados, the other side of the coin is when we repeal this, I'm hoping it will be replaced by something. Incentives should be given for including green technology in your business. So that is where you have an integrated approach to economic policy and environmental policy. If you say you're coming to my country with $100 million, at least 90% of your operation must be run by renewables. So these are the types of creative ways in which we have to move forward when we're talking about building industries. If we are repealing the bill, I really do urge the government to do a needs assessment of the manufacturing sector. Look very closely, and we've been saying it over and over and over, you know, the manufacturing sector and the issues that we've had with the industrial parks and all the like. But there clearly now is a time that we can actually do a needs assessment in the manufacturing sector, because I believe it is a sector that has great potential. It can be successful. Yes, you have your hotel rooms and everything else, but when you have products, when you have a light manufacturing sector that you're actually selling to beauty firms, the demand for products like that is much more reliable than Barbados being sold as a tourist destination. There's a level of comfort in terms of a product versus a service in economies. And you have to diversify. You can't put all of your eggs in one basket. I also find it a bit opportune that now that government is somewhat cash-strapped and we have some issues as it relates to our expenditure and the revenue, and we're going into the IMF program, that we are hastening to repeal this bill. If it was from 2015, I believe, and then we got another extension. Because what repealing this does, and If I'm speaking out of turn, I'm sure I will be corrected by one of the government senators. Government will now be receiving from firms, after you repeal this bill, income tax, corporation tax, trade tax, licensing fees, customs duties, and the list goes on and on. So what I see it as well is plugging a hole, a loophole of revenue, which you can now collect from firms, which you previously were not able to do. So it may be quite opportune. I'm not saying that is the intention of the government, but I'm saying the timing is interesting, to say the least. That you now have these group of companies that previously were exempt from all of these taxes, about 4 or 5 of them. This repeal now makes them eligible to pay these fees and taxes. So with those few words, Mr. President, and a few questions about this repeal, as it targets an industry that clearly needs some technical assistance and an evaluation, I ask the government, repeal and replace it with what? Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you. Senator Grant.
Thank you, Mr. President. I stand in this chamber to give my support to this bill before the House is operating. I'm sure that members will recall that I believe it was sometime last year where the EU would have listed us as a non-cooperative jurisdiction. And I believe reference was made to this, to the Fiscal Incentives Act. I also recognize, sir, that under the World Trade Organization, with respect to ensuring that there are the removal of barriers to trade, that there may be some incompatibility. We're here today, sir, because the truth is that globalization, which essentially reflects creating a global economy where there's free trade and where there are no barriers to entry, has brought us to a point where the Fiscal Incentives Act is not compatible with the requirements of the WTO and, as the leader of government business said, the EU rules. Sir, when we reflect on manufacturing in the 70s and we reflect on the environment that existed at that time, and we look at what is happening in the global environment in 2018, it is fundamentally different. And it is therefore necessary for manufacturing to be able to retool and readjust. Sir, there was a time when, I believe it was in 2000, sir, when the country moved from the utilization of licenses as restrictive entries to products, to the instituting of bound rates of duties, which was agreed on to the WTO, but where those bound rates of duties had to be constantly reduced. The licenses were used, sir, in the past to be able to protect domestic manufacturing. And the protectionist measures which existed in the past, certainly now under the WTO, and certainly as we are cognizant of the development of globalization, can no longer be provided. The truth is, Mr. President, that manufacturing in Barbados does face some challenges. It is very difficult when you have a small base such as Barbados, a small island as well, such as Barbados, for manufacturers to be able to achieve economies of scale. It is also, sir, very difficult in an environment where a lot of manufacturers are manufacturing some of the same things. And also where when you compare manufacturing in Barbados to what is happening in some other countries in the region, and certainly globally, where the cost of labor is high, the cost of raw materials used are high. A lot of raw materials are being imported, and the availability of those raw materials and the use of technology as well is not as extensive as exists in other countries. The point that I'm making, sir, is that there has to be change. You know, there's, I sometimes am referred to by my friends as a Trekkie. Because, Mr. President, I love this television series called Star Trek. In fact, I grew up on Star Trek. And there's a Star Trek series, Star Trek Voyager. And there is a Borg known as 7 of 9. And 7 of 9, Borg drone, became a human again. And in some very challenging circumstances, she very often says, we will adapt. And so it is important that the manufacturing sector is able to adapt and to face the challenges that exist, and to look at manufacturing in a different manner to how it has been looked at in the past. So I believe that it is important that some emphasis be placed on niche markets, and not simply to just talk about niche markets, not simply to have a gut feeling about niche markets, because very often, you know, we talk and we speak to matters in terms of how we feel or our gut feeling. But there has to be a scientific approach. We have to be provided with some technical assistance. I believe that under the BIDC, there was certainly provision in the past for technical assistance with respect to manufacturing. And I think that that is important, to be able to identify specific niche markets, because the reality is that it is going to be difficult to, with the challenges that I identified, for us just to look at the regular type of manufacturing. So I think that that is critical. You know, sir, back in 2001, I would have done some work with a number of manufacturing entities. In fact, sir, I would have visited with quite a number of manufacturing entities. And there are a number of things that were relevant then, which are relevant now. One of the things, sir, related to the technology and manufacturing entities not fully utilizing technology in order to assist them in the manufacturing process. And even when technology was employed and new systems were employed, the truth is they were not utilized efficiently, because many of the systems that were put in place were not utilized for a 24-hour period. In many instances, they were designed to function for 24 hours, and they did not operate for 24 hours. In fact, in many instances, there were social issues which came to the fore, where people, you had a grandmother, a mother, a child, working in the same organization, and there was a reluctance to engage in the utilization of technology because of the social relations that had existed. And sir, the point that I'm making is that if we are going to be competitive with manufacturing, then we do have to ensure that we employ new technology and that we seek to ensure that we're able to access lower cost energy as well, because that, I am reliably informed, is a challenging within the manufacturing sector. The cost, the high cost of energy and the high cost of inputs. So, Mr. President, it is important for the sector to look at the development of special niche market products. And I say niche market products because there must be niche products developed for specific niche markets. I think that that is critical, and that would require that the important support and consultancy work is done in order to be able to facilitate that. I also think, sir, that, in helping to move the manufacturing sector along, we have to strengthen the linkages between manufacturing and agriculture and manufacturing and tourism. Sir, I visited a hotel a couple weeks ago. I don't believe that there would be any issue in referencing the hotel. It was Yellow Bird Hotel, sir. And I was given a tour of the hotel. And I was shown the furniture manufactured here in Barbados. Good quality furniture. And I'm saying to the chamber, sir, that it is important that we strengthen those linkages. I'm aware, sir, that there's the utilization of the black belly sheep skin in relation to black belly products coming from the black belly. And sir, I reference those two elements from tourism and agriculture just to demonstrate that it is important that we strengthen the linkages between sectors in Barbados, because it provides for the opportunity for each sector to support the other, and it also provides for the opportunity, sir, for us to save valuable foreign exchange. So that is an area that we have to look at. Sir, I know as well that there has been quite a bit of talk with respect to condiments. There are a lot of manufacturers. Yeah, the jam, the jellies, the pepper sauce, those kinds of things. But what is necessary is that there is a collaboration between the many producers that you have in order to be able, one, to provide to other sectors, such as the tourism sector, because you have to provide those things in the sizes and the quality and at the price that is required, but there may also be an export potential there as well. We have many different brands of manufactured items in Barbados, and some of them have a uniqueness and an authenticity to them. And so as I reference authenticity, I want to tie in the history of manufacturing to the possibility of exposing that to visitors coming to Barbados. The truth is, sir, that, and I've said it in this chamber on a few occasions, persons visiting Barbados want to have a real experience. Visitors coming now, sir, want to interact with Barbadians, want to be exposed to the culture of Barbados. The truth is that manufacturing has been a very important sector and continues to be a very important sector, even though the contribution to GDP is declining, even though the level of employment has been declining. But it is important, and the history maybe can be provided in and conveyed in a story to our visitors, which could provide another type of visitor attraction. The point is, sir, that we have to start looking inward as opposed to looking outward. And we have to find ways in which, through collaboration with our various entities in the different sectors, to be able, sir, to strengthen what we are doing and to be able to expose our visitors and to be able, sir, to provide for a greater level of sales. Sir, I also believe, and I know that there have been some discussions with respect to government procurement. Again, I want to make this point, that we have to ensure that there is the availability of products. There has to be consistency in quality, consistency in supply, and there has to be consistency with respect to price as well. But I think that government procurement is an area that needs to be further explored, to be given opportunities to those in our manufacturing sector. Sir, the sector, therefore, needs to be more export-driven. In 2001, I believe it was the economic statement coming from the then Minister of Finance, where he indicated that with the removal of all of the licenses and the expectation that the bond rates of duties would be reduced, that it was important for the manufacturing sector to be export ready and export competitive. The truth is that once you're competitive internationally, you can be competitive on the domestic market. The focus right now in the manufacturing sector predominantly is based on the domestic environment, but we also have to provide the incentives, sir, for the exporting. I believe, sir, that it is quite possible for the development of incentives, if those incentives do not exist, that are WTO compatible, because that is the real critical element, that when you facilitate the incentives, that the incentives are WTO compatible. And I think that we have a responsibility to assist the manufacturing sector and to ensure that it survives. And therefore, sir, with those few words, I want to give my support to this bill, recognizing the important role that manufacturing has played in the development of Barbados, but also cognizant of the fact that we certainly have to identify greater opportunities for our manufacturers and to be able to strengthen the linkages that exist with other sectors. I'm obliged to you, sir.
Thank you. Senator Grant, I now recognize Senator Nurse.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just rise to make a few comments in regard to the repeal of this Fiscal Incentives Act. We know that it has been something to a large extent which has been forced on us due to the fact that as part of a number of international organizations, we have to fall into line. And the world now requires that if we want to trade, if we want to be part of this, as to use a catchphrase, a part of this global village, we have to be compliant and we have to be in a position where we are part of a fair trading system throughout the world. So what surprised me a little bit is really that this legislation had not already been repealed, because I am aware that it came to an end a little while ago. So when I saw it on the order paper, it really surprised me that it had. But nevertheless, here we are doing what we need to do to make us compliant with our international obligations. But having done that, I want to raise the issue of, what happens to those companies, and I have no idea how many companies there are which may still be under or utilizing the fiscal incentives. I see nothing in the legislation to protect those companies which may still be under fiscal incentives. Normally, there is usually some grandfathering for those that are those companies that may be currently utilizing the incentives. I know, for example, when we debated the National Social Responsibility Levy repeal about a month ago, there was, for example, a clause dealing with outstanding liabilities and refunds and how those were to be wound down after that NSRL was repealed. And so I am hoping that such companies which may still be, and I don't know if there are any, but if there are, that there's some level of protection so that those companies can still continue to function, having planned their business based on these incentives, that they will be in a position to continue to enjoy those incentives until they expire, or that certainly there will be some other measures put in place which will be some level of compensation for such companies. So the question then, which I think we perhaps more need to discuss today, would be not so much about the repealing of the bill, because we know of the act, but what are we going to be doing as we go forward for our manufacturers in particular, because this fiscal incentive was really geared towards manufacturing. And so what is the government proposing? I have not heard in the presentation, in the introduction of the bill, I've not heard much or anything really in terms of what government is going to be doing to assist the sector as it move on. As we mentioned initially, because of the requirement to be compliant, there's going to be more, and it's going to be more and more difficult to introduce new or other incentives or to assist those that manufacturing sector. And so I think we have to look to see how government can assist those manufacturing companies, not by means of incentives as has worked in the past, but by means of making them more efficient. Is it possible, for example, that government may be able to assist in terms of capital loans or to allow such companies to purchase new and more technologically efficient equipment to help them in the manufacturing processes? I note, for example, that we have recently, and we debated in this chamber, we have recently increased or added to our water rates, which is going to have an impact on our manufacturing concerns. Our fuel tax, which is going to be applying to diesel, for example, is going to have an impact on those manufacturers. And we know that energy cost tends to be a particularly significant cost in the manufacturing sector. So, are there any ways that relief can be granted for those energy costs without affecting our compliance with our international obligations? You see, we, about 4 weeks ago, repealed, in this Senate, we discussed the repeal, as I said earlier, of the National Social Responsibility Levy. That in itself will make the importation of goods much cheaper. What I am worrying about is something which we all know and which we all hear about, something called dumping. That really, so we're looking at two things. The fact that we're making it cheaper to import goods. On the other hand, it's going to be more costly for manufacturers to operate because of the increased costs, energy costs and cost of water that I spoke about earlier. So we can very well find, if we're not very careful, that this Barbados becomes, that we find dumping, and we know basically what we are speaking about when we talk about dumping, and therefore it can have, if government does not seriously or have no plan, must seriously be thinking of how they can, if necessary, have some anti-dumping legislation put in place to ensure that at least we are protecting our importers and our manufacturers, we are protecting our manufacturers from what could turn out to be a level of unfair competition. We also need, I think, to ensure, and we hear it all the time, the difficulties which manufacturers, not only manufacturers, but other importers have with dealing with customs and excise departments, with dealing with the port, where sometimes we see complaints of goods that are urgently needed being held up in the port, or some dispute between the customs authorities and the importer as to what is the value of these goods. And again, all of that tends to add to the whole inefficiency of our our manufacturing sector and of our doing business in Barbados in general. So I would like to think that as part of trying to make our manufacturers more efficient so that they can become more competitive with all of the cheap goods that are coming into Barbados, that we can make sure that we make our ports of entry and our customs departments a lot more efficient than they currently are. We know that other CARICOM countries have had to struggle, Mr. President, with dealing with this fiscal incentives and the necessity to repeal. We know, for example, that Jamaica, and I believe Antigua, and some of the other CARICOM countries have done some other things to which have gotten around this issue. And so there's no harm again, in government having a look and seeing how some of those measures which would have been implemented in CARICOM, in those CARICOM countries, could be adopted to fit into our suite, our situation here in Barbados. And speaking about, and just going a little further, and also, but looking also at other areas of efficiencies, I am thinking, for example, of the Barbados Industrial and Development Corporation, and I'm thinking of Invest Barbados. And then some years ago, we had a split off of this investment Barbados. I was never convinced, and still I'm not certain. There always seemed to be a gray area as to what these two entities do exactly. And I would like to suggest that now government is looking at reducing significantly its expenditure and at its attempts to make government much more efficient. This may be timely that you consider bringing these two entities back together. You could, and that certainly would provide an opportunity for reducing perhaps the amount of transfers that government has to make to those entities, and also in increasing the efficiency of those two entities. I would also like to see perhaps how government can further assist in providing some level of, I mentioned earlier, perhaps capital loans, but in other areas, I would like to see how government can assist in moving the manufacturing sector forward. One of the problems with, and there are a number of things that government have in place now, export credit guarantee schemes, et cetera, which are organized through the Central Bank of Barbados, but they are so cumbersome to work with that I do not think that any significant utilization has become of all of those bits of legislation in place to assist manufacturers. And so another level of efficiency would be to ensure that utilization of such credit guarantee schemes, the VAT schemes, etc., are done in such a way that they are not a hindrance to the manufacturing sector. Mr. President, I think, and the point was raised earlier, but I think it is worth mentioning again, and this has to do with the whole question of niche markets. We can rest assured that we are not going to be able to compete in those products, traditional products, which our manufacturers have done. We have gone past that stage. We can't compete with Costa Rica and the Dominican Republic and other countries in the Central America and the Caribbean, and even further afield, the Asian countries and so on. And so what we have got to begin to think about is what are those niche market products that government can seek to promote in the sector. I can think, for example, there's a company which is making lenses, eye lenses, which are exported all the way to Japan, competing obviously effectively. And therefore, how can we assist those type of companies? There's a company I know that makes sails. This is for yachts and so on. Again, another niche market product. And I think government needs, again, to see how those type of niche market products can be further assisted and expanded under any legislation which we may be able to bring forward. Finally, it is, while the importance of manufacturing has declined over the years, I think that there's opportunities, if properly examined and assessed, for us to get our manufacturing up again. I say that in consideration of the fact that we know what is happening to our international business sector. And that is on the decline. It's going to continue to decline, again, because of all of the blacklisting, because of all of the international obligations which we are going to be forced on, to undertake. And manufacturing, therefore, may pose, we perhaps need to take another look at that and see how we can grow that so that it becomes, again, another very significant contributor to our gross domestic product. So, Mr. President, with those few words, I thank you for.
Next, recognizes Senator Adams.
Thank you, Mr. President. I hope the sound is better than it was the last time I spoke. You're hearing me okay over there? Yes. Okay. I support the repeal of this act, but not without a sense of aggrievement and, if not a bitterness. You know. Some weeks ago, I got to give a toast to a colleague, a wedding toast, that I'd only heard a few weeks prior to that. And it's an Irish wedding toast, but it resonated with me. Ireland, like Barbados, has a difficult history. And I think you'll see what I mean when I give you the toast. So it ran like this: long life and happiness to you, your land without rent, a good woman by your side, and to hell with the Queen, with my excuses. I think anyone with a sense of Barbadian history will perhaps find that second line, our land without rent, particularly strong. It certainly was with me. We're a small nation. We don't have many resources to tap into. We don't have any great political power beyond our own borders. And it's my view that the promulgation of this original Fiscal Incentives Act really embodied that reality. It represents one piece of the legislative firmament in which we incentivized either exports or we tried to attract foreign direct investment to our shores. And after an uneven start, I'd say, as Senator Walker pointed out, we are rather successful at it for a long time. It really represented a growth industry for us. But it's my view that times have changed. You know, that whole, I'll call it an industry of incentives, be it for manufacturing, which is the case with this act, or for services, which Senator Drake touched on briefly in her presentation. That whole firmament has been under attack, sustained attack, for at least a quarter of a century. I thought Senator Walker was very kind in his treatment of the OECD and EU in their role in this attack. But I think it's worth putting on record in this chamber that for all the good they may do in other places, they have done and are doing some harm to us with a very blunt instrument that they've wielded for 25 years. And I heard it for the first time in Senator Nurse's presentation, the blacklist. This is their way of bringing us consistently into line. It's a long history, but I think I'm just going to go back to 2015 to give you a taste of it. So in 2015, I'm going to have to read this because it's a particularly torturous piece of bureaucratic drafting. Barbados signed the OECD's Multilateral Convention on Mutual Administrative Assistance in Tax Matters. So that makes it sound, with the words multilateral and convention, like it was a collective agreement almost, but it's not the case. That kind of soft language actually hides a much harder intent. And the intent is really to dismantle any sort of tax competition that threatens the countries of the OECD and the EU. 2 years later after that, we signed up to something the OECD calls an inclusive framework for what's called base erosion and profit shifting. Again, these are basically measures designed to take away any tools a small country like ours with limited resources and no great political power might employ to diversify its economy away from what I'll call the tyranny of monoculture that Senator Drake's touched on in his presentation. We signed up to that as well. Now, it's notable to point out that a country like the United States hasn't signed up to that base erosion and profit shifting inclusive framework, as the OECD terms it. As befits the most powerful country in the world, they get to self-certify on these matters and tell everybody that, no, we already have a sufficiently robust legislation and measures in place to combat tax avoidance and tax evasion, such as to negate the need to sign up to these kind of agreements. And we are talking about a country that within its frontiers has states that thrive on tax competition. I'm speaking about, in particular, Delaware, who's, I won't say their entire economy, but a very large proportion of it is based on tax competition. But there are others. There's Wyoming, more recently, Nevada, and to some degree even Colorado. And I'm no expert on all the tax frameworks that the states practice, but I think it goes far beyond those. Nonetheless, we signed up in the early part of 2017. Now, at the back end of 2017, the EU decided to place us on a blacklist. Now, again, the EU contains amongst its members, I would say, notorious tax competitors. I'm talking about places like the Netherlands, my personal favorite, Ireland, who will continue to seek their land without rent, and rightly so, Luxembourg, Malta, even Belgium. The EU has taken some of these states to court, and it is going to lose those cases that it's brought against these countries because it is infringing on their sovereign rights. None of those countries I mentioned featured on the blacklist that was published, in which Barbados was on. Indeed, in the frequently asked questions, if you visit the EU's site that talks about this blacklisting, there is one that says, why aren't any European countries listed on the list? And then there's a rationale, a self-serving rationale that follows. All of this to say that repealing this act is one data point in a long trend that has been attacking a set of policies we've used to promote growth, to the degree that I would say those policies are no longer growth policies. They are actually niche policies. We've used that word several times, where we have established expertise in some areas, and we can maintain those niches by adapting to the demands, effectively, that are being handed down to us. Now, it's notable in these discussions, there are not discussions, in fact, in these proclamations from the OECD and the EU, that there is no great substantive dialogue. There's no idea of due process. Certainly there is lip service given to the idea that a sovereign state can practice tax competition. And in fact, it's notable when I look at the abbreviation OECD, that the C stands for cooperation, of which is very little in this story going over at least 25 years. I don't want to lament too long the fact that neither the OECD or the EU seem to have realized their sense of irony has long since gone on sabbatical. I think what's really important for us here is, what does this mean for our socioeconomic development going forward? As I say, I don't believe that the type of strategy, and it does pain me to say that because I'm aware of the architects of some of this legislation. But I do not believe that we can promote growth using these policies anymore. To give you some examples, or a broad explanation of why that might be so. You know, so long as the threat of a blacklist hangs over us, a Damocles-like, and you could almost call it blackmail, but so long as it is there, layers and layers of compliance costs are handed down each time that you're put on a blacklist. These really add up to an increased cost of doing business in our own country. Where these costs fall on banks, and I mentioned the base erosion and profit shifting inclusive framework. Within that, there is a requirement, it may be waived in some cases, but there's a requirement for regional banks to report share tax information with over 100 countries. That's ludicrous. You know, that is a layer of compliance that if you're running a bank, you do everything to get out of that. It is absolutely unfeasible. But where these costs are foisted upon us, we really don't have much choice because the blacklist is a very blunt instrument. If you're on the blacklist, it is a terrible thing. It's bad enough that the costs rise. Excuse me, but there's a further consideration, and that's the risk of de-risking, the chance of being de-risked. De-risking, typically, if I define that, that is the deliberate ending of a financial relationship between a bank and the client of a bank. And in our context, the banks I'm talking about are what are called correspondent banks. These are banks like JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, that process international transaction for smaller regional banks, like the Republics, the First Citizens, CIBCs to some degree. They themselves have huge compliance costs related to know your customer, anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism financing, and indeed there's one study, I think it's 3 years ago, carried out by Reuters, that put the average cost for these global banks for meeting their obligations at $60 million US per bank. Now, that's quite a large sum of money, but it pales in significance to the size of the fines that they'll be liable to if they fail in some degree or they're in breach of these regulations and requirements. And when I say they, I mean them and their clients. So it's the correspondent banks, Wells Fargo, for example, and the respondent banks, First Citizens, local banks that we use on our own island. So I can tell you categorically that in terms of monitoring suspicious transactions, those correspondent banks receive monthly audit reports, some of them in real time, from our local banks to make sure that they're compliant. It's one of the reasons our local banks are relatively conservative in their practices. All those costs add up. Again, when they're borne by our local banks, it actually has the effect of decreasing access to finance. And I think, Senator Holder is here, I think she could probably speak at length about financing for small businesses and how difficult it can be to get the heavy collateral requirements that are demanded of banks. But it all traces back to this fear of being de-risked. Is it possible that an entire country could be de-risked because a correspondent bank, excuse me, feels it no longer wants to carry the potential liability of its customers? Not only is it possible, it's actually happened. It happened to Belize a few years ago. They lost every single correspondent bank. And it was only with the intervention of the IMF in partnership with an entity called the Crown Agents. The Crown Agents historically were the procurement agents for the United Kingdom's Overseas Development Administration, as it was then called. It was only with that intervention that they actually got back their correspondent banks. So anything that risks putting us on a blacklist, that raises the chance of being delisted, well, I'm against. In terms of covering that risk, we have to repeal this sort of legislation. But as I say, it's not without a sense of aggrievement. Now, I think there is a broad opportunity here. We can maintain the niche industries that we have. We can even promote Sea Island cotton. I have to say, as an aside, I'm sorry you don't find Champagne spectacular. But we can promote these kind of manufacturing industries, but they are not as scalable as rebuilding or promoting an entirely new industry. The factors of production are fixed in supply. It's not easy to scale Sea Island cotton or even aloe vera or blackberry sheep. So as you would expect from someone who works in financial technology, I look at other industries and opportunities that the government could support and promote that might, in the longer term, serve to mitigate the risks that the OECD and the EU have created for us and actually promote the broader economy as well. I think the fact that we have to repeal this legislation, therefore, is a warning not to be complacent and a clarion call that we should be innovative. We should seize opportunities, and particularly those in the tech field. I listened to some of the debate in the other place yesterday, and I heard Dr. Sonia Brown talk about how ridiculous it is to go and pay a parking fine. You have to take time off work, go down to court, pay the bill, go back to work. That's a loss of time that translates into a reduction in productivity for the country that multiplied by however many parking tickets there are and however many similar examples there are. That is a cost we can't afford to pay. I'm sorry in some regards that Senator McConney is not here to speak to this. I think she's looking in detail at some of the opportunities technology offers to make us more productive. And I see this at two levels. One, improving things like paying parking fines or other administrative tasks that may go on in the public sector or the private sector. And those are all in the bucket of reducing cost. But some things that reduce cost can actually be turned into profit centers rather than cost centers. I touched on those correspondent banks and the Know Your Customer compliance requirements, AML, KYC, and counterterrorism financing. Those costs are met by each bank individually. Now, imagine if there was some sort of data warehouse they could all consult as a paying service, shift those costs from their books, and that could be run in Barbados. It's not that far-fetched. There are companies already looking at such things. It is only one example of what promoting technology and the financial technology sector might do. And it's one way for us to get back to our land without rent, get back on that road. And I just circled back to the beginning here. We started off with not much more than human capital and the powers of legal creativity in crafting some of this legislation. And the story is the same if we wanted to do it again for technology. All industries need a legal standing and footing, clarity with which to operate. Senator Drake's touched on that in particular with manufacturing. It's the same for everybody. We don't yet have that clarity for something like financial technology, but it's gratifying to be a government senator and know that in the manifesto that the government produced before the election, it really does address the potential of technology as an additional economic pillar for our economy. I think that's very, very important. So if I conclude, I'll go back to that wedding toast, our land without rent. That's very important to me. I don't like to see that we are almost like a cork in the ebb and flow of the global tides without a great deal of control over our future. And it's something I'd like to see us take back as best we can. I'm obliged to you, sir.
Move that we be now suspended.
President, I beg to move that this session be now suspended until 2:15.
It has been moved that the Senate be now suspended for an hour and a half until 2:15. That's an hour and a quarter. All honorable members in favor, please say aye. We are now suspended until 1:15. 2:15, sorry.